for our webinar, Investigating How to NestWatch Your Birds. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm a big fan of citizen science, and I'm a big fan of watching nesting birds as a way to really inspire a connection to nature. So we're going to take kind of a deep dive into this stuff tonight, but first I want to take a moment to introduce you to our platform. So if you haven't joined us before, we are using the Zoom platform. When I went full screen, it probably went full screen for you, so I advise that you come over here to the options section and exit full screen. That way, that will allow you to dock your chat window on the side. So if then you go to the bottom of the screen, hit the chat button, your chat window will be docked at the side and we can participate in a conversation all together. There will be a couple points throughout the webinar where we're doing kind of a discussion. And to help facilitate that, I want you to come down here to where it says 2 and make sure that you select all panelists and attendees. The default is just a panelist, which just means that myself and Lindsay are the only ones who can see it. And I'd love for you to be able to converse together. So make sure to switch to all panelists and attendees. So I'm coming to you live tonight from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. And I was chatting with Anne in the chat window just a moment ago, and it's starting to almost look like this out there. There's no green on the trees yet, but the pond is open and full of diving ducks, and it actually feels like spring is really here, and I'm super excited about it. So I work specifically with the K-12 education team, and our mission here is to create innovative resources and training that builds science skills while inspiring young people to connect to local habitats, explore biodiversity, and engage in citizen science projects. My name is Kelly Schaefer, and I'm the education specialist here. And my partner in crime, Lindsay Glassner, is in the chat window tonight. She'll be answering any questions for you, flagging questions for me to answer at the end, that sort of thing. So feel free to keep her busy in that chat window tonight. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking a lot about the NestWatch Citizen Science Project. We're going to debunk some nesting myths. We're going to talk about some ways to participate in NestWatch and talk about some best practices associated with participating in NestWatch, as well as learning just some nice handy facts about the nesting cycle and how that can relate to finding nests and observing them. And then we'll go through some of those protocols for checking nests in a safe way, both for you and for the birds. So I've already talked several times about citizen science, so I want to make sure that we together kind of define this term. So I'd love for you in the chat window to go ahead and add any keywords or definitions that come to mind when you hear citizen science, or even any projects that you've participated in. And saying science that can be done by everyone. Sharon's pointing out that it's involving ordinary citizens in scientific research, citizens collecting data over time, like Adopt a Stream, that's a great example, Liz. So you guys are hitting the nail on the head here, really. Oh, Samantha's saying public helping collect data for scientific use. Yeah. So it's really all about partnership. It's when regular folks like you and me are collecting data that help put together the puzzle pieces of our world. So a lot of times citizen science involves natural history projects, which can be really great for us as educators. And we really do view it as a partnership between volunteers like us and professional scientists who are collecting data that help answer real-world questions. And that real-world aspect is part of what makes citizen science such a powerful educational tool. So why use citizen science as educators? Well, there's a wealth of reasons, and I've highlighted a few for you here. As I mentioned, many citizen science projects are natural history based, which means they can help us get kids outside, practicing the scientific practices in a really authentic way. It can even lead into kids asking their own questions, capturing that curiosity that kids naturally have, and then turning those questions into opportunities to do inquiry. It does, as I mentioned, really authentically meet our STEM standards and our science practice standards. So kids are out there collecting data, analyzing data, getting really hands-on experience with doing science in the way that scientists do. So kids aren't just practicing science when they do citizen science, they are scientists. And part of this natural history edge to the citizen science projects is that kids are getting outside, they're exploring their local habitats, and this helps them develop a sense of place and a sense of responsibility and ownership over the places where they live and play, which can lead to environmental stewardship. And it really is this authentic access to real-world data and the scientific community. So it has all these wonderful benefits. But of course, one of the most important things is that it's just a lot of fun. It's a really awesome way to shake up the school day and to experience things kids haven't experienced before while learning all of this content and all of these skills that will help them become lifelong learners. And it answers that essential question of why are we doing this? Why is this important? Well, we're doing it because your data really matters, and your data is really helping scientists answer real-world questions. And in the case of NestWatch that we're talking about today, it helps scientists understand bird populations, which helps them make conservation decisions. So it has real-world impact on the birds that share our backyards with us. So NestWatch is a really wonderful project to participate in. It is active in North America, and it takes place, of course, during the breeding season. So that for us would be starting very soon. And there are about 4 components to participating in Project NestWatch, and you can kind of see them down here. So the first step is getting certified, and that means learning to detect nests in a way that is safe for both you and the birds that you're observing, while causing the least amount of disturbance possible. Also, it tells you kind of how to find active nests that you can monitor, then visiting the nests, then reporting that data online. And what's really fun about NestWatch and the website, so nestwatch.org is the website here, is that you can see kind of these records of nesting success. So last year in 2018, or actually 2016, which was the most attempts we've had monitored for the Carolina chickadee, that was 666. And this year in 2019, we're already up to 102. So for those folks in the southern states, you're already in breeding season, and I'm a little bit jealous, but I'm also super happy to see these numbers starting to roll in. So maybe this year we'll beat those records. So that can be a fun area to check out. So again, NestWatch is about becoming certified, finding nests, visiting those nests, and reporting that data. And what's really cool about the data portion of NestWatch is that you have access to the NestWatch data yourself. So you can check it out with your students and do all sorts of cool exploratory projects in that way. So this map here, I think, is a really fun visualization of the power of citizen science in the NestWatch project. So every purple dot on this map is a Nest site that has been reported to Project NestWatch. And you can see in the bottom down here that there have been more than 95,000 nests reported throughout the lifetime of NestWatch. And this is all species that have been recorded. And that is a pretty hefty data set. So if you think about citizen science and how it helps scientists, for scientists alone to recreate this data set would be lifetimes of work. So citizen science is people-powered science, and it amplifies the reach of scientists. It provides us with richer data sets, which provides us with clear answers to the questions that we're looking at. So I love the maps like these because they really help me visualize the impact of people-powered science. So we're gonna jump right into some nesting facts or fiction now that we've developed an understanding of citizen science together. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna read out these 8 statements, and then I would love for you in the chat window to say whether or not you think they're fact or fiction. But first, I want to set up for you how I like to do this activity. So I like this activity because it helps me gauge where students' knowledge where the students' knowledge is relating to nesting birds. So it helps me understand what my students know and what they don't know, what I might need to cover in more depth, and what seems to be common knowledge among them. And it can also be a really fun game. So I like to do this in a large space, and I'll set up one side as fact and one side as fiction, and actually have the students physically move from one side of the room to the other based on what they think. A couple modifications for this would be if you're doing this and you start to see that kids are really feeling unsure, you can add an I don't know section in the middle, and then allow your students to share their reasoning for why they chose the fact side or the fiction side, and then give students the opportunity to change their position based on the evidence and the reasoning that their peers provide. So there's lots of cool ways you can do this. We've also had some teachers who have students who really do better working alone and kind of individually, and they want to build those reading skills too. So they've cut out these statements on slips of paper and then had students sort them into a fact, fiction, or fact or fiction side. And that allows for some group work, that allows for some little small group discussion as well. So there's lots of ways that you can do this. But let's jump right into the statements here. Statement number 1, all birds build nests, fact or fiction? All right. Lots of fictions rolling in. Does anybody want to share a reason or an example for why they say it's fiction? Nice, brown-headed cowbirds. Brown-headed cowbirds are, and cuckoo birds are a great example. So old world cuckoos, our cuckoos in the New World don't do this, but brown-headed cowbirds in the New World do. And that is, they are brood parasites, meaning they don't make their own nests. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. And this is because they evolved to follow along the bison, and you can't follow the bison if you're sitting on a nest for 4 weeks. Killdeer and peregrine falcons have also been suggested. They tend to kind of more scrape away a space and lay eggs on the flat ground. So that can be another great example. One that kids might, you might hear a lot from them are penguins. So like the emperor penguins who lay their eggs and hold them on their feet. So yeah, not all birds build nests. How about statement number 2? Some birds, oh, sorry, there's a typo here. Some birds give birth to live babies rather than eggs. True or false? Or fact or fiction? Very good. Yes, fiction. So this is kind of one of the defining characteristics of birds is that all species lay hard-shelled eggs. And somebody in our last webinar told me this fact that was super cool and I hadn't heard it listed this way, is that birds are one of the only large classes of animals that all reproduce in the same way. And that's by laying hard-shelled eggs. All right, let's see. Number 3, eggs and chicks are not always safe in their nest. Fact or fiction? Anybody want to share some of their reasoning for why they think that is a fact, that birds are not always safe in their nests? Yeah. So I'm seeing predators, snakes, foxes, blue jays eating dove eggs, house sparrows. Yeah, so house sparrows are an interesting example, right? Because they're not always doing it for food. They might be doing it because of competition for nest sites. Samantha's bringing up humans. Yes, we can sometimes, unfortunately, be a danger to birds in their nests. Yeah. All right, number 4, most baby birds are fed seeds and berries by their parents. Fact or fiction? Fiction. What are your examples? Wendy's mentioning pigeons. So some pigeons and doves actually produce a substance called crop milk. Kelly's bringing up chickadees that feed insects. Robins from Anne, yep. Yeah, so you're all bringing up, oh, here's one, a good one, yeah. Eagles and owls and raptors, they feed on meat, and their young feed on meat too. And for as far as songbirds go, many birds do feed their young insects, and that has a lot to do with the need of protein for youngs as they grow. So they're doing a lot of growing in a short time, so they need that protein. There are, however, I want to say 1 or 2 species of birds that are pretty strictly vegetarians, and the one that comes to mind is the American goldfinch. The American goldfinch actually starts nesting later in the summer than other birds, so June and July. And that is because seeds are available more later in the season and they feed their young seeds. So Anne's bringing up hummingbirds too. Hummingbirds are another great example of not just seeds or berries. They might feed some nectar, but they feed a lot of insects. They eat way more insects than we often tend to imagine. Awesome. Okay, number 5, this one can be a little bit tricky. Birds can breathe inside their eggs before they hatch. Fact indeed, yeah. So eggs are calcium carbonate and they are semi-permeable. So gas is able to pass through eggshells. And there are the sacs, is a small sac in the egg that helps with this. And so birds, especially, or chicks, especially as they get older, are actively breathing within their shells. Sometimes when kids have struggled with this statement before, I'll rephrase it to say something more like, do you think, or is it a chick's first breath when they break through their eggshell? So that kind of helps them conceptualize, well, if they're a full-grown chick and they're still inside the shell and they have to physically break out, they're probably breathing before that. All right, let's look at number 6. Only the female mother bird sits on eggs. True or false? Fact or fiction? Yeah, you guys are right. This is fiction. It can be true for some species of birds, like Sherry is mentioning. Hummingbirds, a number of hummingbirds, probably most hummingbirds, I think. It's pretty much exclusively the duty of the female to make the nest and tend the young. Whereas like our cardinals and a lot of our songbirds around here, very many of them, they do share duties at the nest. All right, how about number 7? Most birds live in their nests year-round. This is another one that sometimes trips kids up because we often talk about nests as being where a bird lives. I'm seeing lots of fictions roll in. Any feelings on why that might be the case? Migration is a great example. Nests are for breeding, absolutely. Yes, if you think about it this way, it's actually really dangerous for a bird to be in a predictable location over and over and over again. So birds get very, very secretive when they're nesting. At certain phases of nesting, they'll get very quiet, they'll get very sneaky. They don't want you to know where their nests are because it's risky for them to be in that predictable space all the time. It makes it easier for predators to find them. So there's a benefit to birds for not being in a nest year-round. Cheryl, I just saw Cheryl Lynn's answer here to why birds don't stay in their nests year-round, because you don't see them in their nests year-round. So you've had this observational evidence that they're not there during the wintertime. That's true too. Yeah, that's a good. I love it when kids come out with their observations about birds and share their insights, especially in a peer setting where you're asking for ideas. It's so much fun. All right, let's finish up with number 8. If you find a baby bird, you should try to feed it bread and milk. Fiction, yes. A nice cap lock fiction. Yeah. So we often have very strong instincts if we find a baby bird that tells us that we need to help this bird. But often the ways that we would conceive to help them aren't that helpful, and there are lots of laws protecting baby birds too. So if you see a naked pink baby bird, it's going to be in trouble. That's a nestling. So if you can find the nest, put it back in, or put a little basket in the tree near where you find it, and the parents will often find it based on its begging calls. It's always best for the bird if its parents can take care of it. Otherwise, you probably need to find a rehabber. However, fledglings who are feathered and they're kind of jumping around, they probably don't fly so good. But as long as they're feathered and active and their eyes are open, they're probably in the awkward teenage phase, and man, there's just nothing that you can do for them. We all got to go through it. Unless they're in immediate danger, just leave them be. And there's a great comic about this from Bird and Moon, which I'm going to ask Lindsay to share in the chat window with you. Now we're at the end. Okay, so I see a question from Sarah. Do birds go back to the same nests every year? So that's going to depend a little bit on species. So something like bald eagles are kind of known for using the same nest every year, and they build it up each year until it gets to weigh like 2 tons. But something like songbirds, they really do not use the same nest every year. Cavity nesters maybe, but things like your robin who builds a nest, no. They might come back to the same spot, and sometimes they'll build over top of an old nest, but most of the time it's not the same nest. Yeah, nest boxes and cavity nesters, that's a great exception, Sherry. So communal nesters like purple martins will come back and use the same boxes year after year. A lot of the cavity nesters will, and some of that has to do with the fact that, one, cavities are a little bit safer to nest in to some extent, and 2, they're harder to find. So if you get a good one, you go back to it. Great point. All right, so let's dive in a little bit to some of NestWatch. Oh, sorry, the colors here. So I wanted to bring to your attention that there's a new curriculum out from NestWatch. It's 5th through 8th grade. We helped in the development of this along with New York State 4-H. So it was pilot tested with some 4-H classrooms. And it is a really great introduction to, a really great introduction to Project NestWatch. In fact, a lot of the information I'll be sharing with you tonight is straight from this curriculum. As I mentioned, it is for 5th through 8th grade. So we do have other resources available that are good for younger audiences, and I'll point those out towards the end there. And so even some of the slides I'm using tonight are available for free download online. And Lindsay just shared the link to that in the chat window. All right. So as we talk about NestWatch today, we're going to talk a lot about nest boxes. And that's for a couple of reasons. One being that if you are trying to participate in Project NestWatch with students, it can be a really great project to build a nest box, and you have the opportunity to choose a species that you know that is in your area, and that you will then have a location that you can check, and you have a higher chance of finding a bird nesting there than kind of just looking for nests around in the surrounding area. You can, of course, report those nests to NestWatch. They don't have to be cavity nesters. If you find a robin nesting on the lights at your school, you can watch that nest too. So from the perspective of birds, nest boxes are like tree cavities, and that becomes kind of important because cavity nesters are in a bit of a sticky situation. They need to find these places to nest, and many of them don't build their own cavities. So they're what we would call secondary cavity nesters. Primary cavity nesters are like woodpeckers who make their own cavity, but they don't use the same one over again. When they move on to the next one next year, another bird like a chickadee is going to come in and use it. And we have a tendency to remove the dead trees that make great cavity nesting locations because they're not super safe on our properties or over our trails. And so there are, of course, ways that you can manage your land to allow for snags and dead trees to stand. But nest boxes are a really great way to help make up for some of this deficit for our cavity nesting birds. So let's talk about what makes a good nest box. So there's a number of things. The one on the left here is what we would call a good nest box. It looks pretty plain. It's not super exciting, but it's got everything a bird needs to be happy in its nest. So that sloped roof helps slough off the rain and things like that, makes it a little harder for predators to hang out on. The entrance hole needs to be a specific size. So if you're looking at attracting a specific bird, the hole size is actually really important. So you don't want it to be too big. You want it to be kind of restricted to the smaller size that your target species can handle. So example, a chickadee is not going to nest in a wood duck box that has a big round hole. It's going to nest in one that has a much smaller one because that restricts the number of birds that can access it. It restricts the predators that can access it. So something like a chickadee wouldn't even pay attention to a box with a hole too big. So you want to choose your species and choose the correct entrance hole size, and I'll introduce you to a tool that will help you do that. You want a door that opens so that you can clean out old nest material. We were asking about if birds reuse old nests. They prefer not to. So even from year to year, it's good to clean out the nests from your boxes so that birds can start fresh. If your nest box is on a pole, then you want to include a predator guard. So this is something that keeps predators from climbing up the pole. Usually we call these baffles. So you can have a cone baffle like that, or there's the ones that look like upside down funnels, the actual name of which are escaping me right now. Also, they should be made with untreated wood. You'll often see cedar and pine. These are woods that last for a long time. So if you are looking for nest kits or you're looking to make your own, I would highly recommend cedar or pine. Over here on the right, we see what we would call a bad nest box. It's not securely attached to the tree. It's tied on with string, which can easily fail, which would be a nightmare. I would feel terrible if I put a nest box out there and it fell over with somebody nesting in it. The box is actually quite too small. There's no drainage. It's glued shut, so you can't clean it out. There are 3 holes, which just means more access to predators. It's super brightly colored, which means it's going to be an attention grabber for predators as well. And then those perches, it seems nice to put a perch there and make it easy for birds to land. But the birds that are nesting there, they land on and in the entrance hole and just boop, flip right in. And by putting a perch there, you're actually giving a larger bird, a predator, a blue jay, a starling, something like that, a place to sit and just stick its head in. So no, you don't want to do that. You want to keep it simple. And Lindsay just shared a link in the chat window to one of NestWatch's infographics, which talks about what makes a good birdhouse. So another thing that's really important to consider when you are placing your box is what habitat you have and how that relates to the birds that are going to be in your area. You don't want to put out a bluebird box in a place where bluebirds aren't going to come. So we have 6 habitats here. We have open woodland, wetland, lake, forest, town or city, and shrub. So keep this in mind because I'm going to show you a couple birds now and I want you to tell me where you think they would nest, keeping in mind that they have multiple habitats. Some of them will nest in multiple locations. And you'll notice that I do have the habitats listed here. So let's look at our friends, the wood ducks up here in the upper right-hand corner. Where do you think wood ducks would nest? What habitat? Wetlands and lakes, yeah. And say inner town, if there's enough water nearby. Yeah, so wood ducks are fun because they are ducks who nest in trees and cavities, which I know when I first learned that when I was a kid, that blew my mind that ducks nested in trees. And they do prefer wetlands or lakes on the edges where the trees are. They like to be within a certain distance of water. How about beneath it, the mourning dove? Oh, Wendy, I see that you're asking about nest boxes while we're thinking about where the mourning dove lives. Is now an okay time to clean out your box? There were sparrows nesting last year and they've used it for shelter throughout the winter. I didn't want to take away the safe spot in the winter. Yeah, so now is probably the best time. I'm assuming you're somewhere kind of in the northeast, Wendy. In that case, now would be a good time. Things are about to get, oh, you're Rochester, yeah, go for it. Now would be a good time. You're probably past the worst of the winter and things are just starting to think about breeding now. All right, so back to our mourning dove. We've got some answers rolling in. Mourning doves nesting in towns, yep, absolutely. Forest in the woods, yep. Open woodland, town, city. Yeah, they're pretty adaptable. I don't know if you've all seen a mourning dove nest before, but it is like a really half-hearted pile of sticks. So they're not the most impressive homemakers, but hey, they do well. So, and then beneath them we have a pair of tree swallows. Where of our habitats do you think the tree swallows would nest? Yeah, so Kelly's pointing out that they specifically nest in cavities. Open woodlands, yeah, I've definitely seen them in open woodlands, towns, kind of on the edges, maybe. One of the main habitats, which I didn't list here, I give as an option, would be like meadows, bluebird boxes. Yeah, they often like open spaces too. All right, how about our lovely cardinals? The woods, yep. In the forest, Town, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen them in bushes in the backyard, you know. They're also a pretty sticky nest, but they put a little more effort into it than our mourning dove friends. Nice. And then how about the proverbial early bird, the robin? Towns, forests, almost anywhere. Yeah. Anne had one going off near her today at 4:30. Yeah, now is the time. Yeah, so they are very adaptable too. You'll see them in the woods, you'll see them in open woods, you'll see them on the light fixtures, on the wall. We had one nest like on the wall in the most obvious and open location here at the lab last summer, which was super fun because we put a Nest camera on it. But yeah, they're really great ones to watch. They're super fun if you ever have the opportunity to watch them building their nests, because they collect mud, which is a great clue to it when they're nest building and helps you find them. So cool, great job. All right, so let's jump into the nesting cycle here. This is important because it helps us understand where and when we can look for birds in their nesting cycle. So first, I just want to kind of review the 6 components of the nesting cycle. So what do you think the very first step of the nesting cycle for birds might be? Dating. Yeah, so there is a step that takes place even before dating. So oftentimes it's male birds who are trying to attract the females. And there are a couple of ways that they do this. One of which is singing, which sure comes to mind. Plumage, There's another thing that they need to do and secure before they can attract a mate. Territory, yes. So first, males have to find and defend a territory. So this is an important part for a number of birds, and especially for something like a red-winged blackbird. So if you think about a red-winged blackbird, they really are successful depending on their territory, the quality of their territory. So a really good quality male is going to get a really good quality territory, and he spends a lot of energy defending that territory. And within his territory, he might have several females nesting there. So the better the territory, the more females he gets, the more chances he has to reproduce. So finding and defending a territory can be a really important step. So you have this territory, you're there singing your heart out, you got your shoulder epaulets out, you're showing off your plumage. What's step number 2? Finding a mate, absolutely. Yep. So once you have found your mate, what's the next step? Yeah. Yep. You got to build your nest and lay your eggs. Oh, I just gave away the next step. And once you lay your eggs, you got to incubate them. So this can take a fairly long period of time depending on the birds, the building process and then the incubating process. And as we mentioned before, sometimes incubation is just the job of the female, sometimes both participate. After incubating, what's the next step? Feeding the babies. Yep, so you gotta feed the babies and feed the babies and feed the babies because baby birds are demanding. So we're feeding and raising nestlings. And once we've raised up those nestlings, we've got them nice and fat, what's the last stage of the nesting cycle? Bye-bye. Yep, kick them out. Let them fly free. Fledging, yep. Nestlings fledge from the nest. That's the final step. And so a nest isn't said to be successful until young fledge from it. So you could get all the way through to the nesting phase, and I've seen this happen. You could have 7-day-old young, they're gonna fledge at 14 days, but something comes along and eats them. It's not a successful nest because nobody left the nest. And that is some of the data that you are looking to report to NestWatch. So NestWatch is really concerned about the number of young raised, if they fledge successfully, if it's taken by a predator, if you have any clue as to what kind of predator it might have been, things like that are super, super useful data for Project NestWatch. All right, so let's take a closer look at some of these stages. So finding and defending a territory. Nearly all birds defend a territory during the breeding season. For communal nesting birds or colony nesting birds, their territory might be very, very small within the communal nesting space. What's important, though, is that their territory contains all of the resources that they need to live and to raise their young. So it can't be just enough to feed them, it's got to be enough to feed their young, too. Finding a mate, as we talked about, males have to work really hard for this a lot of times. Sometimes it involves song and aerial displays, crazy plumages. They got to be good at selecting nesting locations. So think about house wren. The male often goes around and builds a bunch of dummy nests in locations. And the female kind of picks her favorite location. And often there's feeding, like pair feeding, involved in finding a mate. The next step is building a nest. Here you see a chickadee pictured with what looks like some plant fuzz, could be fur. There's all sorts of different materials, natural materials that birds will use: mud, sticks, leaves, twigs, pebbles, hair and fur and feathers. So sometimes you will see, you'll actually see tree swallows fighting over feathers. I don't know what it is about white feathers and tree swallows, but they love them, and they will put on these crazy aerial battles to be the one who comes away with the white feather. So that's kind of fun to see. I've also seen chickadees pull hair out of coyote scat before, or fur out of coyote scat, so they'll go to some great lengths to get their fur and feathers that they need. They also will use some unnatural materials. I've seen a lot of catbird nests with plastic in it. So all sorts of different things you might find. So if you see a bird carrying some of these materials, it's a good sense for you to twig in and think, oh, this bird's acting nesty. So there are all sorts of different types of nests that you might encounter out there. You guys have probably seen platform nests around for ospreys and bald eagles. The scrape nest we talked about a little bit. So these are for our ground nesters who might just scrape away and expose the dirt and lay their eggs right on the ground. Sometimes they line them with things like this nest, which appears to be shells. Dome nests, so things like ovenbirds and I want to say Kentucky warblers and things like that build nests that are covered on top. Pendant nests for things like orioles. These are the woven nests that hang down. Cavity nests, so that would be our woodpeckers and our birds that nest in nest boxes like chickadees and house wrens and titmice and bluebirds. And then of course the good old classic cup nest, this courtesy of our friend the robin here. So these are nests that are open cups. You can find them anywhere. These are probably the second most popular that get reported to Project NestWatch. All right, next step, of course, is laying the eggs, as we talked about. So females lay eggs in clutches. So that would be the number of eggs laid during a single nesting attempt. And for a lot of our songbirds, typical songbirds, that's going to come to about 4 eggs. So bluebirds around 4, thrushes, robins around 4. If anybody has had a house wren nest before, you know that they will lay many times that. They'll lay 9 or something like that. Oh, somebody's pointing out that Carolina wrens will nest in anything. They absolutely will. There's pictures online somewhere of one nesting in a bag of nails. Like, if you were going to build a nest, that would be the last place I would choose. But then again, I'm not a Carolina wren. All right, and so laying time varies, but females do lay eggs 1 at a time, so 1 a day. And that's going to become important when we start thinking about checking nests. The next step is incubating eggs. So chicks, in order to develop, must have a pretty constant temperature, and so that means that parents spend a lot of time sitting on them and keeping them warm. Many females tend to develop a brood patch, which would be a bare patch of skin on the belly that fills with fluid and has the veins nice and close to the surface, so it's very warm, and they keep that on the eggs. If it's very hot out, you might actually see robins standing over their nest to shade their eggs, so they're playing that game of keeping the temperature constant. And then once those chicks hatch, it's time to start the feeding game. A lot of chicks, when they hatch, they have this little egg tooth that they use to break the shell. That process is called pipping. And it can actually be something that you observe when you are checking nests. You can see the egg just starting to pip, and that's really exciting. It's super cool to see. So there's a couple different kinds of hatchlings. So something like your Canada geese or your ducks are going to have precocial hatchlings. And these are ones that are more developed and independent. So they're ready to go and walk and swim pretty much the day that they're born. On the other hand, we have altricial young. These are our pink, naked, squirmy babies whose eyes are closed and they can't really lift up their heads. And they are really dependent on their parents. It's going to be most of your songbirds. So often, these are the ones that are getting reported most frequently to NestWatch. So then we're on the feeding and raising young stage. This can look like a lot of things depending on the species and what they're feeding and how often they're going. I love this picture here of the hummingbird, though. You can see how small the hummingbird's beak is to begin with. So it's kind of fun to imagine that growing out as they grow up. And feeding young, they're going to be coming back and forth to their nest a lot. So that can be sometimes a useful time to find nests, or an easy time to find nests. And then finally, fledging from the nest. So when a nestling is grown and has feathers and is able to leave the nest, but not necessarily capable of full flight, then it is a fledgling. But it has its full first set of flight feathers. So let's talk a little bit now about what it takes to participate in NestWatch and to do it in a way that's safe both for you and for the birds that you're watching and causes minimal disturbance. So NestWatch actually has this certification that we've talked about, which has a code of conduct for how you can minimize the risk of accidental harm to a nest. So the NestWatch code of conduct goes through a number of useful tips for you. So one of the best being, make sure that you plan ahead for your visits. So you're going to want to observe a nest every 3 to 4 days. We don't want you to do it every day because we want to minimize our interruptions to the nesting cycle. Most songbird nests are going to be about 4 weeks, 30 days, or thereabouts. So that's going to be many visits. So you do want to plan ahead for these visits and make sure they're going to fall in times when you can do them. And you want to keep those visits short, no longer than a minute. So NestWatch has available for you data sheets. So if you want to take paper data sheets, you can do that. You can download that from the link that Lindsay shared to where the curriculum is. Or it has now a new free app, so you can enter data that way. Usually what this means to keep your visit down around a minute is you're going to check the nest, you're going to count the eggs or observe whatever's going on, and then move away from the nest to to write down your data. So some do's and don'ts. You do not want to check nests early in the morning or late in the evening. So female birds, when they're in the laying stage, they do that in the morning. So usually before 10 a.m. So when they're in that laying stage, you want to kind of avoid that. You don't want to disturb them early in the morning. You don't want to push off a bird at dusk right as it's getting dark because they like to stay on their nests all night and you might push them off in a time where they don't come back. You want to not approach nests during early incubation. This is kind of a fragile time for some birds. They don't want to be pushed off the nest in the first couple of days of incubation. So you can, however, observe nests from a distance. So if you get lucky and the female isn't on the nest when you come, so if you're able to check it from a distance, where you see her pop off the nest as you are getting a little bit closer, then go ahead and check the nest, and that's okay. So you only want to approach in these early days of incubation when the female leaves the nest on her own. And then again, and this is why it's really important to kind of keep pretty good tabs on the nest, so you have some idea when the young are reaching that final stage, getting close to fledging. If you come too close to fledging, they have a predator response where they're kind of ready to go. They wouldn't leave on their own yet, but if they get scared, they'll leave and they won't come back. So you want to be very careful about that. Again, you could observe the nest from far, even a cavity nest. If the adult comes to feed, oftentimes you'll see heads shooting out on those last few days because they're very hungry, so you can do it then. And of course, you want to avoid bad weather. So if it's raining or cold or really damp, postpone the check for later in the day if you can, or go another day, just because by pushing the female off or keeping her from going back, you're exposing the eggs to unfavorable temperatures. And then this is the big one. You don't want to be the reason that a predator finds the nest. So if you have a nest and you go to it the same way and back from it every day, you're going to create a one-way path that ends at the nest, which is kind of like a signal for a predator, hey, there's something cool here. So the best practice is to approach the nest from one angle and leave from a different angle, and do that differently every day that you go, and so that you don't make a super obvious trail. A lot of our predators are very smart. So if you think about something like a crow or a blue jay, they're smart birds. I used to work on nest studies, so nesting cycle studies for wood thrush and indigo buntings and Acadian flycatchers, and some of those we were putting cameras on the nests, and the crows are so smart that they will recognize that a camera means that there's a nest in a radius of that camera. So we had to start like camouflaging the cameras to make sure that the crows did not catch on. So you just want to be cautious. And by doing that method of coming in and leaving from a different angle every day, you're doing your due diligence. And again, we just want to be respectful. We want to approach the nest with care. If you have time and ability to wait and see if the female comes off for a couple minutes, that's great. Otherwise, approach the nest box. If it is in a box, knock very gently and quietly on the side, and give the female a couple seconds to flush before you open the box, because that would be a much more stressful interaction for her if you pop the box open and then you're staring into each other's face and both of you are terrified. So, and then don't force the bird off the nest if you can do that at all. So like if you open the box and the female, for example, tree sparrow, is on that thing and she's staring at you and she's not gonna go, she's feeling feisty, don't push her off. If at all possible, come back the next day and see if you can see it, the eggs. The good thing about if the female's on the nest, you know the nest is still active, so you can make note of that. And again, you don't want to handle things in the nest if at all possible, the eggs or the young. It is a myth that birds will abandon their young if they smell like people. They won't. They're very dedicated parents. Once there's eggs or young in a nest, they're much, much, much less likely to abandon. However, we don't want to take that as free license to handle things. A great piece of advice I can give you is to have some kind of mirror. So I used to use a mirror on a compass all the time, where if you can get a mirror on a little tiny pole, that's going to give you lots of opportunity for looking inside the nest without having to reach in if it's just a little bit above your eye line. So there's tools that you can use to help with that. And then now that we know our code of conduct, of course, the next step for participating NestWatch is finding nests. There's all sorts of different nests out there. Some of them you've probably observed before. I love this image of the barn swallow nest because once they get to a certain age, they're just popping out over the rim and it's pretty wonderful to watch. So you can absolutely observe barn swallow nests for NestWatch. You might need a mirror pole to see the number of eggs, but at a certain point, you're going to be able to see the number of young, which is good data too. So here are some clues to finding birds during different nesting cycles. So during nest building is a great way to start spotting nests. Birds will show you the way at this point. If you see something with twigs hanging out of its mouth or grass or hair, that's a great sign to you to pay attention. Watch where it goes. If it comes in and out of the same general location, note that and come back a couple days later. Birds will abandon during the nest building period. So if they get really freaked out, if you're around too much while they're building their nest, they're gonna bounce. So you can follow them to a general area and then examine that in a couple days and try and find the nest. During the egg laying period, the females are gonna be no help. They're only gonna be on the nest for that couple hours in the morning when they're laying, and then she's not gonna be around. She doesn't wanna call any attention to that nest. During incubation, the female is gonna be pretty quiet and pretty secretive, but you might see her disappear over and over again in the same area. And if you are walking by a bush or something and a bird flies out very quietly and then maybe pops up into a tree and starts yelling at you, you've just flushed it off a nest probably. So if it's very quiet and kind of seems sneaky when it's leaving, it's a good chance that you might want to check out that bush that it was just in. During the nestling phase, parents are harried and their babies are hungry and loud. So they will give you all sorts of different clues. They're going to be removing fecal sacs, feeding birds. The young are going to be begging. So you might be able to find nests during that stage too. The only thing is you want to be careful when you approach, because if they're near the fledgling stage, you won't really have a strong idea of this unless you watch the nest before you approach. And I just want to point out again that NestWatch has a lot of really awesome data that you can dive into. Your data really matters because we can use it to understand trends in birds over long periods of time. So this is about, 18 years worth of data that we're looking at here from 1997 to 2015 for mountain bluebirds. And you can see that there are some this is their nesting success. You can see that there are high points and low points, but the average is staying pretty steady around 78.7%. But if we saw that average starting to decrease, then we would know that there's something going on with the species and we need to worry about it. So for example, think about the DDT crisis and what this graph might have looked like for peregrine falcons, for example. So that's why this data is important to us. When we have enough data for enough years, we can start to see declines or increases in species. NestWatch has a really great interactive for you called Right Bird, Right House that you can use to check out species in your area that are in decline, and maybe those are the ones that you're going to want to participate in. So your data does really matter. The kids' data is super important. NestWatch helps us understand bird populations on a much larger scale, which helps us make conservation decisions and helps us detect problems as they're happening before they get too drastic. So again, there's this curriculum online, Thinking Outside the Nest Box. Check it out, 5th through 8th grade, free download. If you work with younger age groups, I highly recommend the Educator's Guide for On Bird Hill. This is a whimsical, lovely book from Jane Yolen, but it does get into bird reproduction, so it can be a great way to introduce that. And there's lots of fun activities in this guide that are aligned to standards. And then, of course, if you go out there and you put out your nest boxes, you're dealing with real life. So you always run the risk that something might happen to your nests, which means you don't get to observe the full cycle of nesting. And that can be kind of sad, but it is nature. And so I recommend, as a supplemental resource, the bird cams. So if you do put nest boxes out there and something goes wrong, but you still want to keep going with your nesting and life cycles lessons, the bird cams can be a really great way to do that. So I recommend that as another resource to you. Now, I just went a minute over, so if you have questions, now is a great time to ask them in the chat window. Lindsay shared a bunch of links with you tonight. This webinar is being recorded and will be up on the YouTube channel tomorrow or Monday, and we will